Self-hatred embeds almost in the person's DNA. It is part of the essence of the person. You're not going to overcome self-hatred by hating somebody else. Hatred just is going to breed hatred. They don't see it as something separate from. Whereas self-criticism, you can see as something separate from you. When people feel anger, when people feel sadness, when people feel jealousy or envy or rage or whatever it is, if you're highly sensitive, those emotional experiences lead to a level of pain that is unbearable, to the point that death seems like an excellent solution. If you think of emotions as glue, when you have a criticism and it activates your emotions, it's almost like that emotion then becomes a glue that reminds you of that criticism.
What is the prognosis for someone who is experiencing self-hatred? What are the chances that they can restore their sense of self?
There's a massive market for self-hatred. Modern life markets to self-hatred. You're not pretty enough. You're not thin enough. Your skin isn't clear enough. In an era where you yourself don't think that you're enough, you're going to believe that you were born flawed. You're going to believe that you deserve the bad things that happen to you. You're going to believe that nothing will ever change. You learned to hate yourself. If you can learn to hate yourself, you can learn to love yourself, because love comes much more naturally to the human heart than hatred does.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dreamcatcher podcast, a place where your dreams can find a voice. I'm your host, Celine Chenoy. Thank you to all of you who return every week to tune in to become a better version of yourself. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already, and rate our show if you enjoy this episode. Experiencing self-doubt from time to time is usually not a cause of concern. However, for certain people, these feelings and negative thoughts can get out of control and significantly impact every aspect of their lives, from personal relationships to professional success. My guest, Dr. Blaise A. Aguirre, describes this emotion as self-hatred, which encompasses feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and low self-worth. I invite you to join our discussion to explore this prevalent issue and discover ways we can work towards overcoming it. Dr. Blaise Aguirre is an expert in child psychiatry, including psychotherapy and psychopharmacology. He is the medical director of 3 East at Harvard-affiliated McLean Hospital, a continuum of care using dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, program for young people manifesting self-endangering behaviors and borderline personality traits. He has been a staff psychiatrist at McLean Hospital since 2000 and is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. In this eye-opening discussion, Dr. Blaise highlights the profound effects self-hatred can have on people from diverse backgrounds and their families. He will also explore the origins of self-hatred and provide actionable tips for overcoming these obstacles. Hello, Blaise. How are you doing today?
Good. It's very cold in Boston. It's 16 degrees Fahrenheit. It's I think minus 10 Celsius. So kind of chilly getting into work this morning. Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Other than that, pretty good. Thank you so much.
Well, I do remember it being that cold because I did live in Boston for 2 years. So I remember those really frigid mornings and, me trying to wear 3 layers as I made it to my campus. But anyway, I'm glad that you're here and you made it. It's wonderful to have you on the show because I think that your work is so essential because there's a pervasive sense of not enoughness in our society, especially among younger people. And I'm curious to know, what are the personal and professional experiences that led you to become more aware of this phenomenon in society?
Thank you so much. It's such a great question, and I love your concept of not enoughness, because I think it's exactly a step in the direction of self-hatred, that you start off in this place. I'm not enough. So what led me to this idea? So I do a therapy known as dialectical behavior therapy, and dialectical behavior therapy was developed for people who struggle with very self-destructive behavior, self-injury, suicide, relational problems, difficulty in regulating their emotions. And what dialectical behavior therapy has shown in lots and lots of research is it's reduced the level of self-destructive behaviors in people. And so when we started my program in 2007, there was an expectation that about 10% of the people that we would see would possibly take their lives, sadly, because of the pain of emotional suffering. Through dialectical behavior therapy, we've reduced that number tremendously to maybe less than 0.5%. So from 10% to 0.5%. But still, there was a small group of people who tragically took their lives. And I wondered what it was about that group, that no matter what we did, that life was just too painful to live. And what in like reviewing their charts and then just speaking to current patients, the one thing that they all shared in common was a very, very profound self-hatred. And so it got me thinking about, okay, well, whenever somebody comes into therapy and they have a problem, the therapist's task is to help the patient address that problem. And so I said, okay, well, let's help patients address their self-hatred. And no matter what I did, I couldn't reduce the self-hatred. So people would stop engaging in toxic relationships. They would stop substance use. They would stop suicidal behaviors. They would start going to school. They would start doing the things we wanted them to do. But when it came to changing the construct of self, that didn't change. And that was particularly worrisome to me. And it was very sad for me to just see people who I cared deeply about suffering with this construct of self. DBT isn't helping. Are there other therapies that are helping for self-hatred? And I couldn't find anything. So I decided like this was the time to do something about self-hatred.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to deal with that, because it must have been painful to lose some of the people that you were treating. Mm-hmm. Self-hatred sounds like a very intense feeling, Blaise. Where does that fall on the continuum of the relationship that we have with ourselves? I mean, how is it different from someone who's just being self-critical and has an awareness of things that they would like to improve in themselves? Where does it lie on that continuum?
So again, you're so wonderfully prepared, because these are such critical questions, and I mean, most of us have the experience of having done something that we weren't maybe that happy about, or maybe something didn't turn out that well, and maybe we're a little bit self-critical. It certainly happened in my job where maybe I wasn't at my best in therapy, where I did or said something that was hurtful to a patient, and I regretted having said that. And that I can, from a point of view of who I am as an individual, sort of see that I've done something that wasn't aligned with my values, that wasn't my best self. And I can say, okay, you know what? That didn't go very well. I regret it. I need to do better. I can ask for help, but I can see that as separate from my standard practice. That most of the time, many of the things that I do turn out more or less the way that I want them to, and that when they don't, there will be some self-criticism, self-judgment. But I see that as sort of a separate entity. Self-hatred embeds almost in the person's DNA. So if I were to say to you, can you think about something maybe yesterday that you weren't that happy about? Most of us could probably think about something that maybe didn't go well. But if I were to say to you, what is your spleen doing right now? You'd say, what? What are you talking about? But, it's an integral part of who you are. Your spleen, it's just there and it's doing whatever it's doing. So self-hatred has this quality when somebody has pervasive and enduring self-hatred, that it is part of the essence of the person. They don't see it as something separate from. So whereas self-criticism you can see as something separate from you, that self-hatred for the people who struggle with core self-hatred, they don't see it as a separate entity. And again, like every now and then, I've seen patients say to me things like, I'm so stupid. Why did I date that guy? Why did I date that girl? I hate myself. But it's a very transient state, and it's sort of like it's a statement of dissatisfaction. But like at their core, they don't have that core self-hatred. For people who have core self-hatred, they don't see it as separate from who they are.
They've internalized it.
They have internalized it in the way, is English your native language?
Yes.
Okay. And how did you learn to speak English?
My parents spoke English to me since I was born.
Right. And so do you speak any, Greek?
Nope.
No. And the only way that you would have spoken Greek would have been to have been, adopted by a Greek family or moved to Greece when you were very, very young. And so this concept of you don't even question, why do I speak English? It's not even a thought. It's just part of what comes out of your mouth when you start to communicate with other people, because it's just an intrinsic. You don't sort of say, oh, wow, I'm speaking English right now. It's just part of who you are. And it's something that you learn from very, very young. And it generally doesn't cause you problems. It would cause you problems if you moved to the Congo and they didn't speak any English, and then you had to speak Congolese, and you said, well, I don't know how to speak it. So that English is embedded in the construct that is Celine. So is self-hatred for the patients who struggle with it. And that's why it's so hard to sort of see it as separate from.
So what are the origins of self-hatred? Is there a genetic component, or is it just based on how we're raised, or a combination of both?
So I was thinking a lot about this question when I was writing the book. Are there biological predispositions to self-hatred? The one thing that I can tell you is that the patients who I've lost, who had core self-hatred, and the ones who I'm currently working with, who have core self-hatred, are all highly sensitive people, and so they that they're highly sensitive to. Emotionally sensitive, sometimes also physically sensitive to noises, sounds, and other things like that. So they've got a highly sensitive nervous system. Now, the vast majority of highly sensitive people do fine with their life. I'm a very sensitive person. Many of my colleagues who are therapists are highly sensitive people. A lot of people who I meet in the arts are highly sensitive people, and that's fine. But for highly sensitive people, when they have early insults, and by insults I mean anything that shatters their sense of safety, their sense of integrity, whether it's childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, severe bullying. For the highly sensitive person, they absorb that and then start to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with them. For people who are not highly sensitive, and you say, oh, you're so stupid or something like that, they'll say whatever, and then they move on. But for the highly sensitive person, if you insult them, you say, you're a stupid person or something like that, it sits with them in a way that they then begin to not only believe it, but begin to look at the world and look for confirmation that that statement is actually true. And so they begin to filter out any possible positive messages that are coming from the world and begin to see those sorts of negative messages, and they conclude that it is because they are somehow faulty individuals.
Interesting. Is that why there tends to be higher depression and suicide rates among artists versus politicians? Because artists tend to be more sensitive, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we know that people who are more sensitive are more likely to die by suicide than people who aren't. So, and that's because when you're highly, one thing that many people don't really understand, for those who don't experience it, if you're driving a golf cart, you experience 30 kilometers an hour as the top speed. If you're driving a Ferrari, you're experiencing, 200 kilometers an hour as the top speed or whatever it is. But the person who's driving the golf cart can't experience what it's like to be in the very fast car. The person in the very fast car can know what it's like to travel slower, but they also know what it's like to travel faster. And so for somebody who's got a lot of emotional sensitivity, to try to explain to somebody who doesn't have a lot of emotional sensitivity how strong emotions are very painful is sort of confusing. Like, what are you talking about that emotions are very painful? And so when people feel anger, when people feel sadness, when people feel jealousy or envy or rage or whatever it is, if you're highly sensitive, those emotional experiences lead to a level of pain that is unbearable, to the point that death seems like an excellent solution, unfortunately.
So for someone who identifies as a sensitive person, are there any foundations that they should lay in their life, have a certain lifestyle, a code of conduct that they should keep in mind to prevent themselves from slipping into that dangerous territory of self-hatred?
Mm-hmm. So one thing I want to say about that is that, interestingly enough, I interviewed, all of them, every single one of them, and every single one I spoke to, their self-hatred started in childhood. I haven't actually met a person who was not self-hating, through childhood and adolescence, who later on in life, in their 20s or 30s, develop self-hatred. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying that I haven't met that person. But nevertheless, to your point, a highly sensitive person is much more likely to be impacted by what they perceive as judgment. So if you're a highly sensitive person, and then I say, something about, your appearance, your way of thinking, your choices or whatever it is, those kinds of things tend to stick much more in your psyche than for somebody who isn't. And that is because if you think of emotions as glue, that when you have a criticism that you perceive as critical and it activates your emotions, it's almost like that emotion then becomes a glue that reminds you of that criticism. And, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that strong emotions were necessary for our protection. I mean, if you were running around in a cave and there was like a saber-toothed tiger and you got afraid, you'd want to make sure that you knew what to do and how to protect yourself and how to be careful about which cave you chose. But for highly sensitive people, even though there's no more saber-toothed tigers, that system persists. And it can be really beneficial. I mean, it creates great art. Creates great music, great poetry. But on the flip side of it is that that highly emotionally arousing situations can cause that kind of pain. And so your question is, can a highly sensitive person protect themselves against that impact? And I think one of the things that we do in our work is we identify situations with people that are more likely to cause upset. So, for example, let's just say that as a highly sensitive person, when you have like 50 family members all talking at you at a major holiday, it's just very, very upsetting. So then we might say, okay, you know what? We know that that's true. At the same time, you want to be able to be part of the family. So why don't you notice when you're becoming emotionally upset, take a break, maybe go to your room, go outside, go and do something, get your nervous system to come down, and then reintegrate, rather than white knuckling it through the event and then having that explode at the end of the day. And then we also often do a lot of work with the family or with friends, just to say, hey, look, this is a highly sensitive person, and so they might be taking breaks. At the same time, we also want them to develop a thicker emotional skin. Because the world is not always going to be accommodating. It's sort of like noticing for themselves, I'm getting emotionally aroused. Can I listen to music? What can I do in the moment?
I would imagine relationships are a minefield for people with this tendency. Like, they have to be very careful about the partner that they choose.
Very, very, very much so. And so what we see is a range of solutions to this problem. So one is, I'm a flawed individual. Bad things have happened to me. I deserve it. It's my karma. I'm not worthy. And so I deserve bad partners. And by bad partners, I mean people who are going to be abusive to me, because that's going to be my legacy. It's part of the universe's punishment of me. I can't get someone who's ever going to listen to me, etc. So that's one option. Another option I see is people choosing someone who's almost the exact opposite. So, for example, if you're a very, very highly sensitive person, you're an artist, you're emotionally up and down, they maybe date similar people and it doesn't work out, but then they meet somebody who's in accounting, who, maybe their emotional range is more that of the golf cart rather than the Ferrari. And they say, well, at least it doesn't activate that person so much. The only problem with that is that then they feel that they're not emotionally stimulated. The third one is to sort of match their own style.
Can you just say more about that? Yeah. That them not feeling emotionally stimulated?
Yeah, because again, if you've been driving a golf cart, if you've been used to driving this Ferrari, and then you're driving around in a golf cart, but you really like the speed of the Ferrari, and now it's sort of like you're driving the golf cart. Yes, it's safe. Yes, you can have conversations. Yes, you can, take time and look around. But what stimulates you is sort of more emotional kind of activation. And now, but what you don't want if you're driving that Ferrari is somebody who doesn't know how to drive a fast car, because, when you have strong emotions, if you don't know how to regulate those emotions, you can veer off track, and quite quickly. And so on the one hand, it's pleasant, it's safe, it's comfortable, but it doesn't speak to a part of your soul, a part of your psyche that just needs, lives at a higher arousal level. And it can be okay. It's not that it's necessarily bad, but I mean, I've also had that but they're kind of boring. I mean, I love them, but they're kind of boring. Yeah. So, really the task is to have a person capable of managing their emotional experience without it veering out of control. And then finding somebody who can validate and tolerate and accept the highly sensitive person without being hurtful, who can sort of understand and, yeah. But when you don't feel that good about yourself, you're very unlikely to pick
someone who treats you well.
A healthy somebody, right? Somebody who treats you well. And again, I mean, it's your task as an individual to be able to manage that, and to make a decision like, I am not going to be with this person because they aren't treating me well. But I think it's when you don't believe that you're deserving of anything else, then you just, continue along that path, which is, unfortunate.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to announce the upcoming launch of my new book titled The Nomadic Soul, a seeker's guide to finding a sense of self and belonging in the modern world, which highlights a profound yet often unexplored part of your identity that holds the key to everything from answering your biggest questions to finding deeper meaning and joy in everyday life. Visit thenomadicsoulbook.com to learn more, download a free chapter, or to buy a copy. So for someone who is predisposed to self-hatred, what goes wrong? At what point do they start kind of going down the rabbit hole? When do you see that happening when you're treating your clients?
Yeah, so first of all, and one of the things I point out in the book is that when a person goes in for a psychiatric evaluation, we ask them about depression, about anxiety, about sleep, about their relationships, about how they're eating, about eating behaviors, about whether they hear voices and all sorts of things. But we almost never ask them about how they see themselves, whether they like themselves or not. And so often, and now though, I've asked all my colleagues and myself, when I'm seeing somebody making these kinds of choices in relationships, etc., and putting themselves down, I will ask, how much do you like yourself? And they'll often say, not very much. And then I'll say, well, do you ever experience self-hatred? They say, actually, all the time. And not everyone, by the way, just because a lot of highly sensitive people don't hate themselves, but I'm just saying for the people who come and do the work with me. And then, so when I ask them, when did you start to notice self-hatred? It's such a strange question to them. It's like saying, when did you first start noticing that you had a nose? It's like all of my life. I mean, it's always been there. And so for them, it's like, it's always been there. I don't remember a time I didn't. So there's something that happens in early childhood where the message is that you're broken, that you're faulty. And it starts to, the only explanation that you can have is that statement is true. You see, the reason why I don't think adults would develop self-hatred if they don't already have it is because, if I insulted you and then you said like, well, first of all, boy, that was really rude. Why did you insult me? I don't want to speak to you anymore. And then I'm going to go speak to my friends. Hey, do you think I'm ignorant or whatever it is? Like you can contextualize it because you've got a much bigger network of people that you can bounce ideas from. And then you also know that there are people who are going to be very, very supportive. When you're a child, your universe is your parents, maybe some people at school. But then you go to school and they're like teasing you. And then you start to see, wow, I'm hurt at home. And I'm hurt at school. And by the way, the hurt doesn't have to be, no parent wants to have a child that self-hates. Of course they don't. But for the highly sensitive child, experiences of any kind of rejection can be interpreted as that I am flawed in some way. I am broken in some way. and then a belief that that is true. And especially if maybe there are other siblings in the house who maybe they're successful, maybe they're better sports people, maybe they're better at academics. And you know, the message, whether explicit or implicit, is if you were only more like your sister, if you were only more like your brother, then you'd be happier. But you know, you can only be as good as you are, because you know no one can be better at you than at being you than you are. But then, you know, maybe if you're a younger child, you're trying to emulate something that you cannot be, because that is just not in your nature to be. You know, so the problem is that by the time that they get to me, they've had like 10 years of this experience, and it hasn't been challenged. You know, and it doesn't show. Like if you get a cut, you're bleeding, you go to your mom, like saying, oh, there it is. If you're depressed, you're shut down. But when people self-hate, it's something that is internal to who they are.
Yeah. So for someone who does not have trained eyes or trained ears like you, a parent or a teacher or a caretaker, how can they identify a child or a teenager who might be experiencing self-hate?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, you know, if a child, I always tell parents, if a child says, I'm going to kill myself, you know, that's always something to be taken very seriously, and you've got to pay full attention. If a child says, I hate myself, that's another one that has to be taken really, really seriously. Now, it could be, I missed the penalty kick. I'm so stupid. My teammates hate me. I hate myself. And then it's just like a transient state. Like, tell me what happened, you know? And so you're curious with your kid, and they say, no, I don't really, but it was just like, I really screwed up at that situation. Okay, fine. But maybe they say, I hate myself. And it's telling the child that they shouldn't hate themselves does not work. So that's one thing a parent shouldn't do. Also, telling a child that you love them doesn't override the script that they have internally. So the first thing is, if you see a child making that statement, I hate myself. The second thing is when there's a degree of people-pleasing behavior, self-critical statements, self-judgment, perfectionism. Because when, as a perfectionist, like, you haven't done things right. Self-critical is, I got something wrong. Self-judgment is like, you know, I'm stupid, I'm fat, I'm ugly, you know, those kinds of things, those kinds of things. So when you hear those, then again, to start to get curious with your child about where that's coming from. Or maybe a child is tolerating bullying behavior, online bullying behavior, misuse by teachers, maybe from other people. And you sort of think like, wait, why is my kid tolerating this? Well, maybe because they think that they deserve it. So whenever you start to hear those, it's critical that you take them very, very seriously. And it's because without taking them seriously, for the highly sensitive child, they're going to integrate those criticisms into a sense of who they are, those judgments into a sense of who they are. They're people-pleasing into, I need to satisfy everybody else before myself. Otherwise, no one's going to like me. And so what happens is that they, you know, so if you see a child who's doing a lot of people pleasing, a lot of self-judgment, a lot of self-criticism, a lot of perfectionism, all the patients who I've seen who have core self-hatred said that those were elemental components of self-hatred. In and of themselves, they weren't self-hatred, but they started to build the wall around self-hatred, around core self-hatred, that didn't allow self-hatred not to exist. So they were all there. So those are all component pieces. And as a parent, I would I would look for those behaviors.
Thank you for sharing that, Blaise. I'm sure that's going to help a lot of parents listening to this, teachers as well. I think it's really important that they pick up on these signs that someone might be enduring those painful feelings. What is the prognosis for someone who is experiencing self-hatred? I mean, what are the chances that they can, restore their sense of self and feel good about themselves?
Great question. I think when people back in the day developed HIV or maybe COVID or maybe cancer or whatever it is, the prognosis was always terrible until when? Until we discovered ways to treat whatever it was. So if you come to therapy for your depression, for your anxiety, and I help you with your depression, your anxiety, but the self-hatred stays there, well, then, of course, you're never going to get better because it's never been addressed. And for me, the task was to address this in a way that hadn't been addressed before. Now, in the same way that we believe many conditions were incurable, but then new treatments came along, when I started applying some of the ideas that I've developed in working with my patients to core self-hatred, what I've seen is a manifestation of greatness, of beauty, of success, of self-acceptance that has taken place over time. And it's just like wonderful to see. I now get one of my favorite patients, and I've known her like 17 years now. Well, she's not my patient anymore, but she annoys me because she sends me pictures of her kids all the time. And I say, you got to leave me alone. I'm not your therapist anymore. And she says, you're never getting rid of me. And so I went from this kid who was like wanting to die to married mom of 3 kids, loves her husband, sends me pictures of her kids all the time. And I said, look, my iPhone's blowing up with all the pictures of the kids. She's a nurse now. She's taking care of other people. But it's because she started to challenge the idea that she wasn't worthy, that she wasn't lovable, that she wasn't capable. But I couldn't get at it through traditional therapy. And even just telling someone that you love them isn't going to, it's sort of like if I say, don't be allergic to peanuts. I mean, no amount of me telling you that isn't going to stop you from being allergic to peanuts if you're allergic to peanuts. It's sort of that's a piece of work that she needed to do to get to the other side. So I think that when we start asking about it and addressing it, that the prognosis is going to be good, because. But without addressing it, it's not that good. And one of the reasons it's so paired to suicide is because people who hate themselves feel that they're not worthy. And if you feel that you're not worthy, you feel that you're a burden. And when you feel that you're a burden, you feel that the thing that you can do to take that burden away permanently is to take your life. And there's no amount of, when parents say that's just not true, like that's not how I'd feel, I'd be devastated. They say, well, that's my parents, they have to say things like that. They just don't, it doesn't resonate as true because that's not how they feel. I think that the prognosis with direct questioning and targeting is going to really improve it. But right now, it's not that good, unfortunately.
Why do you say that?
Because I think that when, as I said, when I reviewed the records of the people we've had so many people come through our program that the suicide rate should have probably been, we should have maybe lost 500 people to suicide, according to statistics. Fortunately, but tragically, we've only lost maybe 25 or 30. So, massive reduction in anticipated deaths by suicide. But of those ones that took their life, they all had core self-hatred. So I just think that living with that core self-hatred is just so painful. Now, some people feel that it is a sin, it is unethical, it is unkind to take your life, that it is selfish. But then what they're doing is living with severe, severe emotional pain, and which really impacts their jobs, their relationship choices, their day-to-day decisions, how they treat themselves vis-a-vis, relationships with other people. So it's a very, very heavy burden to carry.
I can imagine. I mean, I'm guessing that the people listening to this podcast most likely do not experience self-hatred. But if there is that one person, what would you say to them? What's something that they can do to start that process?
I want to speak to that person in 1 second. But there's two things. Because one of the things that I address in the book is also versions or cousins of self-hatred, and that's the self-criticism, self-judgment, and all of those sorts of things that are also somewhat difficult to shift, and that if allowed to persist can coalesce and become self-hatred. And the other thing is, even though you're right, most people who are listening to the podcast aren't going to have core self-hatred, that as a parent, and you asked this question earlier, what if, how would I know? What can I do? And the reason I want to underscore this point is that modern life markets to self-hatred. You know what? You're not pretty enough. You're not thin enough. You're not curvy enough. Your skin isn't clear enough. You're too white. You're too dark. You're not smart enough. But if you buy my product, all your problems will go away. And so there's a massive market for self-hatred, and certainly self-dissatisfaction. And I think that people are bombarded with constant images of perceived perfection, and you're not that. So my worry is that, in fact, in an era where you yourself don't think that you're enough, that social media messaging tells you that you're not enough because you can't do as many push-ups, you don't drive as nice a car.
Yeah, they just stoke the fire of self-hatred, don't they?
Of self-hatred, you're just not enough. Okay, so what I'm saying is that a lot of the techniques that are in here are not like only for self-hatred. Perfectionism, self-criticism, self-judgment, all of that, those ideas as well.
Shades of it.
Exactly. 50 shades of gray, 50 shades of 50 shades of self-hatred. So now, what about that one person who really listens to this and really identifies with this concept?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would say is that you're going to believe that you were born flawed. You're going to believe that you deserve the bad things that happen to you. You're going to believe that nothing will ever change. You're sick and tired of people telling you that you've got to love yourself, and you hear this message all the time. You're going to hear that, if you practice self-compassion, that this is going to shift, and it just won't. And what I would say is that one, you learned to hate yourself. A child is not born hating itself. A child hates. And the beautiful thing is this: if you can learn to hate yourself, you can learn to love yourself, because love comes much more naturally to the human heart than hatred does. So you had to learn it in the same way that you just told me that you learned to speak English because that's the family that you were born in. Everybody spoke English. Whatever happened in your childhood, you learned to speak self-hatred. Now, the problem is that your teachers of self-hatred were toxic people in your life. But you continue to listen to them. If I say to you, 1 + 1 is 3, 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 and I give you a test at the end of the year, and I say, what's 1 + 1? You're going to put down 3, and you're going to be completely wrong, because I was a bad teacher who taught you incorrectly. So who were the teachers of self-hatred? Who were the people who were so judgmental of you, who criticized you all the time, who told you that you weren't enough? And where were the protective people who should have taken you under their arm and told you that you were wonderful? So you've learned how to hate yourself. Okay. You can learn to not, you can learn to stop, you can learn to love yourself. But you have to start off by thinking like, wait a second, I learned this. You weren't born this way. You just weren't. You had to learn it. And then think about who were the people in my life, early childhood. Maybe it was bullies at school. Maybe it was a caregiver. Maybe it was teachers that messaged this idea that I wasn't enough. Maybe I was being abused physically or sexually or emotionally. And there was no one there who taught me any other language, who taught me any other way of thinking. And maybe when I complained, or maybe when I said something, or maybe I was so scared to say something, but maybe if I said, oh, caregiver, this terrible thing is happening to me, that they said, well, you're overreacting. It's not true. It's not happening. So even the safe people are rejecting your experience. But it's a false, one thing that's come up in the US in terms of elections, like this concept of fake news. Your self-hatred is fake news. You learned it at an early age. It was reinforced by hurtful teachers, and it can start changing today. Write it down. When did I learn it? Who were my teachers? And then recognize how they were so wrong.
Wow, that was so powerful and compassionate. If you can learn to hate yourself, you can learn to love yourself.
Yeah.
That is so true.
And you know what? And we have to learn things all the time. If I say, Celine, you are going to move to the Central African Republic or the Congo, and people aren't going to speak your language, or you're going to move to Japan. All right, I learned English. I can learn to speak Japanese. It's like I can learn this other thing. But in the situation where you have English and Japanese, it's not like English is wrong and Japanese is right. It's just like Japanese is right in that context. In this situation, the self-hatred is actually wrong, and it's toxic, and it's just not true. And it didn't come from like your DNA. What came from your DNA is that you're a sensitive person. I get that. But a sensitive person is much more likely to hate themselves than not, because that's the language that they learn. It's the messaging that they're getting. Now, the other thing is this. It may not be the intention of a parent, a caregiver, and other people to have a child who self-hate. It may not have been their intention. But nevertheless, that is the message that they learn. You don't want to get stuck in blame. You're not going to overcome your own self-hatred by hating somebody else. Hatred just is going to breed hatred. So it's like you can have, just because you have compassion for people who've maybe even not been very kind to you, doesn't mean you have to hang out with them, doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of time with them. But you can also put them aside as like hurtful teachers.
Yeah, that's so true. And I mean, they might have been damaged themselves. They might be hating themselves as well. Yeah, yes.
100%.
It trickles down, doesn't it?
100%. And I have this funny discussion with my colleague, because people will often say to me, "Well, then who's to blame?" So I say, I'll tell you who's to blame: the Big Bang. Because without the Big Bang, there aren't the single cell organisms, and then the multi-cell organisms, and then the monkeys and all this sort of stuff. Because you're right, it's sort of like chasing down that route. Even if you said, wait a second, my great-grandmother hated herself. Mm. Okay, now you understand where it came from, but so what? Well, also, why did she hate herself? We don't even know why she hated herself. So it doesn't matter that you understand. This is why I don't work so much with insight. People who smoke have the insight that smoking is bad for them. It doesn't stop them from smoking. Simply having insight doesn't necessarily. It's a nice thing to know. It doesn't change behavior. People who don't exercise have the insight that not exercising is unhealthy, but that doesn't get them exercising. So it's moving moving beyond insight. It's moving beyond like simply understanding that this is true. It's like saying, okay, you learned this, but you weren't born this way. And you can learn something else. You can learn the truth about yourself. And when you see yourself in your glory, in your magnificence, and whether you're a person who believes in God, multiple gods, the universe, it didn't single you out as someone deserving of this cruelty.
Yeah. Blaise, thank you so much. I really appreciate you opening our eyes and being our guide towards developing a healthy and loving relationship with ourselves. I mean, that is just a foundational piece of living a happy life, really. And I definitely encourage everyone to get a copy of Blaise's book, I Hate Myself, Overcome Self-Hatred, and Realize Why You're Wrong About You. Yep, there it is. There it is.
No, but it actually, it's coming out. My publisher told me that it's actually arriving this week. They sent me the cover that they put on another book, but that's, okay. That's the book.
Yeah, it's that beautiful orange cover. And you can purchase it wherever books are sold. And Blaise, do you have a website that people can check out to learn more about you and if you offer any services of any kind?
Yeah, so there's two things. One is I actually created a website for the book called IHateMyselfBook.com. But the other thing is I'm at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. And my program is known as 3 East at McLean Hospital. So it's the number 3, the word east.org. And it talks a lot about the dialectical behavior therapy that I was talking about. The self-hatred stuff is still, it's really in its evolution at the moment. So, wanting to develop further protocols and fine-tune it. But yeah, okay. I'm at...
I'll make sure I'll add the link to the show notes.